Hi guys, good morning. Today we are going to start our discussion related to Docker. Docker is one of the most famous tool in the applications. Docker developers are going to use and DevOps engineers also going to use this. So let's start our journey with the Docker. So before going to start this Docker, first we need to understand what is an application and what is application architecture and what are application environments. So we need to understand first what is an application. We need to understand application tech stack, and we need to understand application architecture. Then once we understand these details, then we will understand life without Docker. Then we will understand life with Docker. So that means what are the challenges we are going to face in our applications where we don't use Docker, and how Docker is going to help us in solving those challenges. All right. So first, what is an application? Project. So we can say project, application or project. So application is nothing but collection of programs. Application is nothing but collection of programs. Here, if you take any project like Gmail application or Facebook application, IRCTC application, Make My Trip application. So several functionalities will be available in the application. Application is nothing but collection of programs. So here, these are software applications we are developing, right? So application architecture. Every application contains 3 layers, guys. Every application contains 3 layers. So those are called as presentation layer. Those are called as presentation layer and we can also call this presentation layer as front end of the application. We can call this as a front end of the application. Here, user interface will be available. And we will have back end of the application. Here, business logic will be executed. And we will be having a database. So if you take any project, the project will contain collection of programs. Application is nothing but collection of programs. Every application contains 3 layers. What are those 3 layers? One is front end of the application, and the second one is back end of the application, and database will be available. So let's assume that this is front end of our project, and this is back end of our project, and this is database of our project, like this. So every project will have front end, back end, and database. Back end contains business logic and the front end contains presentation logic. So whatever we see on the application, that is called front end. So end user will communicate with the front end of the application. End users are going to communicate with the front end of the application. Now we are accessing Gmail, www.gmail.com. We will open the Gmail application and we will perform some operations on the Gmail. So user will send a request by using front end, then it will send the response back to the user. So here user will be available, request will be available, response will be available. When user is performing some operation on the front end, that front end is going to communicate with the back end of the application. That back end is going to communicate with the database of the application. So like this, a project will execute. If you go for any project, this is a common architecture that they are going to follow. Front end that contains presentation logic, user interface will be available. Now, if you go to any project, for example, let's take a scenario. Let us take a scenario of our Make My Trip application. So if you go to Make My Trip application, you can see some user interface. So this is called front end of the application. And when you click on flights, right, it is giving some logic here. I'm selecting Hyderabad to Mumbai. So this month end, what are the flights that are available to travel from Hyderabad to Mumbai. Got it. So I'm selecting this Hyderabad and Mumbai. Here I have the option to select the stations, airports, and click on search option. When I click on the search option, the request is going to the backend and they are fetching the flights which are available in the database and it is displaying on the front end. So here, similarly, I can go for hotels checking also. So hotels available, check-in date, check-out date. In the Goa, what are the hotels available for tomorrow? Click on search. So here I can change my date and assume that I want the hotels for this month end 30 to 31st and click on apply. So when I click on search, so it is going to the backend and it is fetching the hotels which are available in the database. So like this, for every application, front end will be available, backend will be available, database will be available. So in the front end, what is there? The front end contains user interface, guys. That means whatever you see on the website, that is called user interface. So user interface logic will be available in the front end. And what is available in the back end? In the back end, the business logic will be available. So what operation user is performing, based on that, backend code will be executed. So in the database, they are going to maintain the data. What are the flights available? What are the hotels available? What are the trains available? That complete information will be available in the database. And here, user will be available. User will be sending a request and response. A user will be sending the request and the user will be receiving the response. This is application architecture. So tomorrow, as a DevOps engineer, when we are deploying our applications, first we need to understand what is architecture of our application. So this is called application architecture. When we have application architecture like this, what is the technology stack? What is the technology stack will be there? Now here, guys, nowadays, to develop the front end of the application, people are going to use either Angular or React.js or Vue.js. So like this, there are several technologies are available which are used to develop front end of the application. So people may go for Angular. Some projects may developed by using Angular. Some projects may developed by using React.js. Some projects may developed by using Vue.js. So these are different technologies that are available to develop front end of the application. Okay, some projects may use Angular, some projects may use React.js, some project may use Vue.js. Then what about the backend? So backend contains the business logic. Some companies will use Java to develop the backend of the application. Some projects will use .NET to develop the backend. Some people will use Python to develop the backend. Some people will use Node.js to develop the backend. Some people will use PHP to develop the backend. So like this, there are several technologies are available in order to develop backend of the application. Like this, there are several technologies are available in order to develop backend of the application. So front end contains the user interface. In the front end, some people will use Angular for the front end development. I mean, one project may use Angular, another project may use React, another project may use Vue.js. So to develop the front end. So front end user will access and the user will perform some operation. Then the request will go to the backend to develop the backend of the project. Some projects will use Java based projects, .NET based projects, Python based projects, Node.js based projects, PHP based projects will be available. Then coming to database. So some people will use Oracle database. Some people will use Oracle database. Some people will use MySQL database. Some people will use SQL Server, and some people will go for MongoDB. Some people will go for MongoDB. MongoDB is a NoSQL database. The remaining are SQL databases. Some projects may use Postgres SQL. Some people will use Postgres SQL database, right? So these are SQL databases, and this is a NoSQL database. Depends on the project requirement. They will use one database to store their application data. When user is registered, user data will be stored into database. Okay, and when user is booking a ticket, what tickets booked by user, that information will be stored into database. When user is trying to book the hotel. So what is the user booking history? That complete information will be available in the database. So this is called application architecture. This is common. Technologies may change. Some projects will use Angular for the front end and Java for the back end. Some projects may use React.js for the front end, Node.js for the back end. Some projects may use Vue.js for the front end and Python in the back end. And they will use either Oracle database or MySQL database or MongoDB. That depends upon the requirement. Like this, tech stack will be available. So developers should understand what is the tech stack of the project, and DevOps engineers also should understand what is the tech stack of the project. Because as a DevOps engineer, we are responsible to automate, build and deployment process of the project. So when we want to automate, build and deployment process of the project, first we need to understand build process of the project. Java project will have one build process. Python projects will have different build process. Node.js projects will have different build process. Angular, React, every project will have their own build process. So if it is a Java-based project, we are compiling the project, we are packaging the project as a jar file or war file, and we are deploying that jar file or war file. But for Python, war file will not be available because Python is a scripting, right? And when we go for Node.js, war file will not be available. When we go for Angular, war file will not be available. That means every technology having their own structure to run the application. Every project will have different build process mechanism. Every project will have different packaging structure to run that. So as a DevOps engineer, we need to understand that. Are you clear with my point? So now when this backend is available, our backend application can communicate with third-party applications also. They are called as web services. Now here, Make My Trip application is available. So when we go for the Make My Trip application, this Make My Trip application providing the facility to book the flight tickets as well as providing the facility to book the train tickets. So when you try to book a train ticket in the Make My Trip, that Make My Trip application will communicate with one more project that is called IRCTC. It will communicate with one more project called IRCTC project that is called Web Service Communication. One project will communicate with the another project to reuse the business logic. So Make My Trip backend application will communicate with the IRCTC application that is called Web Services. So business to business communication. Make My Trip is doing the business, IRCTC is doing the business. As part of the business communication, one application is going to communicate with the another application. Those are called as distributed applications. To achieve this distributed communication, web services comes into picture. One project will talk to another project. Are you guys getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? Come on, guys. So what is a web service? Why we need to go for the web services? What is a web service? Why we need to go for the web services? Web services are used to establish communication from one project to another project. If one project wants to communicate with the another project, then web services comes into picture. And similarly, nowadays we are following the microservices architecture, right? Front end is developed as one project, back end is developed as one project. Here also a web service only. Front end application is communicating with the back end application. We can call it as a web service communication. We will call it as a web service communication. Are you getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? Perfect. Now guys, here application will contain 3 layers. Application is nothing but collection of programs. Every application contains 3 layers. Front end will be available, back end will be available, and the database will be available. So now front end tech stack, the front end tech stack, some projects may use Angular, Some projects may use React.js. Some projects may use Vue.js. These are the technologies that are using in the industry to develop a application. Coming to the backend, as we discussed, in the backend, we may have Java, we may have .NET, we may have Python, we may have Node.js, etc. .NET, Python, Node.js, PHP, like this. They are used to develop backend of the application. Coming to the database, some projects will use SQL databases, some projects will use NoSQL databases. Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, and MongoDB. Right. So this is tech stack of the project. Now, when we have a project like this, how to deploy the project? Now, in order to run my project, I need to install the database in the computer, and I need to install Java in the computer, and I need to install the Angular in the computer. For example, assume that our project is using Angular. Here, our project is using Angular, and it is using Java, and it is using Oracle database. Get my point? Assume that. Let's take a scenario of one project. So our project is using Angular in the front end, and it is using Java in the back end, and it is using Oracle database. Now, as a DevOps engineer, I want to deploy this application so that users can access. So in order to deploy this application, first I need to take one machine. I need one machine first. So in that machine, I need to install all the required softwares. For example, I'm taking one machine. In this machine, I need to deploy my application. Front end is available, back end is available, database is available. So in this machine, I need to install Angular, NG, and I need to install Java, and I need to install Oracle. Okay, so these are the softwares that are required to run my application. These are the softwares that are required to run my application. So Angular should be installed, Java should be installed, Oracle database should be installed. Along with this, I need to install Tomcat server, which is used to deploy our Java web application. Angular plus Java plus Oracle plus Tomcat. So if my computer is having all these dependencies, then only my application can be executed. So on top of all these softwares, our application is going to run. So it is the responsibility of the operations team to set up a machine with all the required softwares. Once all the softwares are available, then deploy the application and execute the application. Deploy the application and execute the application. Got my point, guys? So here, if I want to run my project, if I want to deploy my project, to execute the front-end components, front-end software should be installed. Angular should be installed in my machine. So to execute the back-end of the project, I want to install Java. And to work with the database, I need to install the database software. Angular plus Java plus Oracle plus Tomcat. I need to install all the softwares. Once all these softwares are installed, then only I can run my application. So this is the environment setup that we need to do in order to run our application. Now assume that, so this, whatever the setup I have done, this setup is called as dev environment. So developers are going to deploy their application in the dev environment, and developers are going to test that application. So once the testing is completed, then I want to give the project for SIT environment. So where testers are going to test the application. So one more environment, nothing but a platform which is used to run our application. So all the developers completed the coding. The developers want to test how their code is working. For that, in the real time, we are going to set up a dev environment. That means one computer we are going to take. In that computer, we need to install all the required softwares and we need to deploy our application. Okay, in the dev environment, everything is working as expected. Whatever the code done by the developers, that code will be available in the GitHub. So here we will use Git repository. From the Git repository, we will take the code and we will deploy that code into dev environment. So directly we cannot deploy the code because our code is having front-end, back-end database. So we need to install all the required softwares in order to run our application. Okay, I have taken one computer. In that computer, I have installed all the required softwares and I have deployed my application. That is fine. So in the dev environment, the code is working as expected. After dev testing is completed, after developer testing is completed, now I want to give the code for the testing team. So that is SIT environment. System integration testing will be available. So in the SIT environment, again, I need to install all the softwares in the computer. A separate computer we are using in the SIT environment. So in the SIT environment, again, I need to install the Angular. Again, I need to install Java and I need to install Oracle and I need to install Tomcat. So all these softwares I need to install in the SIT environment also, then only I can execute my application in the SIT environment. So if you see, whatever the softwares we have installed, which versions of the softwares we have installed in the dev environment, same version of the softwares should be installed in the SIT environment also to execute our application. That means our application is having a dependency with the Angular software, Java software, Oracle database, Tomcat server. Our application is having dependency with the Angular for front end, Java for the back end, Oracle database, Tomcat server. To execute front end portion of our application, Angular software should be installed in the computer. To execute backend components in our application, Java software should be installed. To store the data, we need to install the database software. To run our application, we need to install the Tomcat server. So these are called as dependencies which are required for our application execution. So it is the responsibility of the operational engineer, DevOps engineer, to set up this environment and deploy the application. Okay, in the dev environment they have installed. So here what they have done is they have installed Angular. They have installed Angular 14 version here and Java 11 version here and Oracle database Oracle 13, Oracle 15 they have installed here. Tomcat 9.x version 9 version they have installed. So this is our softwares that we are using in our application. Now, when it comes to the SIT environment, here by mistake they installed Angular 13 and they installed Java 8. They installed Oracle 15, Tomcat 8. So now, what is the problem? SIT environment is prepared by one of the DevOps team member and this dev environment prepared by one of the DevOps engineer. Assume that, so Raja is one of the DevOps engineer in the team. This Raja prepared the dev environment to deploy our application. So Raja installed Angular 14 version, Java 11 version, Oracle 15 version, Tomcat 9 version. And here there is another person called Naveen. So this Naveen is a new team member in the DevOps. In the DevOps team, he is a new joinee. So this Naveen has prepared the SIT environment. So in the SIT, he installed Angular 13, he installed Java 8, Oracle and Tomcat. So now, once the testers started testing our application, testers will say that the code is not working. So whatever the code that worked in the dev environment, same code is not working now. Whatever the code that worked in the dev environment, that same code is not working now. Why it is not working? Because of a versions problem. So actually our code is developed by using Java 11 features, Angular 14 features. But in the SIT environment, by mistake, this Naveen installed Angular 13 version, Java 8 version. So our code is not compatible with Angular 13 and Java 8. Our code requires Angular 14 and Java 11 versions to execute. Are you guys understanding what are the challenges we are going to face in the real time to execute our project? So project nothing but collection of programs, and the project contains layers. So front end will be available, back end will be available, database will be available. So front end will be developed by using one technology, back end will be developed by using another technology, and a database also will be used in the project. Got my point? So in order to run this application, we need to install all the required softwares. Then only we can run our application. Developers will write the code. Developers will store the code into GitHub. Once the developers store the code into the GitHub, it is the responsibility of the operational engineer to set up the environment. What is the meaning of environment? Environment nothing but a platform which is used to run our application. Dev environment. In my project, developers done the coding part, and those developers want to test how the code is working. So for that, one dev environment will be available. Now, similarly, we need to set up UAT environment, and we need to set up the prod environment also. So developers testing will happen in the project, testers testing will happen in the project, and similarly, UAT testing will happen. Then finally, our project will go to production. Okay, dev environment, sit environment, and UAT environment, and prod environment, like this, multiple environments will be available to run our application. So this is called as UAT environment. That means user acceptance testing. Before deploying the project to the client live environment, we will give for the UAT, for user acceptance testing. So in the UAT, if I want to execute my project in the UAT, again we need to install Angular software, Java software, database software, Tomcat software. Every environment will use a different machine. So here, the UAT environment is prepared by another DevOps team member called Sunil. So in our team, multiple DevOps engineers are available. Raja worked on the dev environment deployment. Naveen worked on the sit environment deployment. Sunil worked on the UAT environment deployment. And finally, here we are having prod environment. Prod is nothing but production. That is the live environment. The code is deploying into live environment. Assume that. So this deployment is doing by Ashok in the production environment. So if I want to deploy the code into the production environment, in the production system, I need to set up all the required softwares. In the production environment, I need to set up all the required softwares. So without installing the softwares, our project cannot execute. Our project needs Angular to execute the front end. Our project needs Java to execute the back end. Our project needs Oracle and a Tomcat server. Are you clear with my point? So now can you understand what are the problems that we are going to face in the real-time project deployment? Are you guys able to understand what are the problems that we are facing in the real-time environment? So multiple team members are available. Multiple team members are working on multiple environments in our project. Multiple team members are available. Multiple team members working on multiple environments in the project. One team member is working on dev environment. Another team member is working on sit environment. Another team member is working on UAT environment. Another team member is working on production environment. So dev environment will be used by the developers for testing purpose. Sit environment will be used by testers to test the application. UAT environment will be used by the client to test the functionality, and the production environment is nothing but it is a live environment. The code will be deployed to production, then only people can access that functionality. So now here, can you see any challenges involved in deploying this application to these many environments? Guys, can you see any challenges in order to deploy this application to these environments? Can you see any challenges involved in order to deploy this application to these many environments? Guys, come on. Any challenges are involved in order to deploy these applications, in order to run this application? Any challenges available? Challenges are not available. Challenges available in the deploying the application. Challenges are not available in deploying the application. Come on, folks, speak out. Challenges involved or challenges are not involved? Challenges are involved because we need to maintain same versions of the softwares in all the environments. Then only our application will execute. We need to maintain same versions of the software. Then only our application will execute. Otherwise, application cannot execute. So if your project is not using the Docker, then it is very difficult to set up the environments. It is very difficult to install the softwares. Everybody should follow same version when they are setting up the environment. Are you guys getting my point? Everybody should follow the same version in order to run the application. So Raja is one team member who prepared the dev environment. He installed Angular, Java, Oracle, Tomcat in the dev machine and deployed the application. So he set up the dev environment and he is deploying that application. Then if you go for sit environment is prepared by the Naveen. Naveen used different versions of the software. The application which is working in one computer may not work in the another computer because of this versions compatibility. The application which is working in one computer may not work in the another computer because of the version compatibility. We should be very careful when we are running our application in the particular machine. So which version of Java is available, which version of the Angular is available, which version of the database is available, which version of the server is available. So we need to take care of all these things and we need to run our application. If any version mismatch happened, then our application execution may fail. If any mismatch happened, then our application execution may fail. Are you clear? So this is the life without Docker. Life without Docker. So we need to take care of the software's installation, particular versions in order to run our application. So in the real time, our application will be deployed into multiple environments. So dev environment will be available, sit environment will be available, UAT environment will be available. Dev environment will be available, sit environment will be available, UAT will be available, production will be available. Life without Docker. So in real time, our application will be deployed. Our application will be deployed into multiple environments for testing purpose. Okay, guys. So what are those environments? First one is dev environment. Second one is sit environment. And the third one is UAT environment. And some people will use pre-pilot. That means pre-production environment will be available, which is called pilot environment. Before production, that application will be tested in the pre-production. Once the testing is completed in all the environments, finally, application will be deployed into production environment. Once the testing completed in all above environments, then it will be deployed into production. Then it will be deployed into prod environment, nothing but production environment. So production, nothing but the production environment is the live environment. So the people who are accessing our application, that will be from the production environment. Production environment means live environment. We are accessing Gmail. That is nothing but Gmail application is in the production. We are accessing Facebook. That means Facebook is in the production. We are accessing IRCTC available in the production. So we can say application environments. We can say that application environments. In the real time, multiple environments will be available in order to test our application. So who will test this? Who will use this dev environment? Developer testing. So developers testing will happen in the dev environment. Who will use this SIT environment? SIT environment will be used by testing team, right? UAT environment will be used here, client side team. Client side testing will happen. Pilot environment, testing with live data. Testing with live data will happen in the pilot environment. So we need to set up a dev environment so that developers will test their code is working or not in the dev environment. Once the developers testing is completed, then we need to set up our application in the SIT environment so that testers are going to test our application. After that, we need to set up the UAT environment so that client-side testing will happen. So who is our client? So that client is going to test our application and the client is going to decide go or no go. If a client identify any bugs in the code, no go. That means nothing but don't go for production. If a client don't identify anything, if a client is happy with the project, then he will give go. Go means go for production. Before going for the production, applications will be tested with the live data. For that, we are going to use pilot environment, right? So once the pilot testing is also completed, then production environment will be available. So production environment means live environment. End users will access the application from the production environment only. End users will access application from production environment. So we are accessing gmail.com. We are accessing facebook.com, right? All these things are from the production. So testing team is nothing but QA team. Testing team is going nothing but QA team, that is SIT. So SIT stands for System Integration Testing. UAT stands for User Acceptance Testing. So testing team will perform System Integration Testing and UAT nothing but User Acceptance Testing. System Integration Testing and User Acceptance Testing will be available. Now guys, in the real time, these environments will be available. Now, life without Docker. If I am not using Docker, then what is the problem? If I am not using the Docker, then what is the problem? We need to install required softwares. We need to install required softwares in all environments. We need to make sure we are using same versions of softwares in all machines. Okay guys, we need to install required softwares in all environments to run our application. We need to make sure we are using same versions of softwares in all machines. If any software version is not matched, then application execution may fail. Are you guys getting my point? What is the problem? If you run your application without a Docker also, you can run the application. There is no problem. Without a Docker also, you can run your application. There is no problem. Are you guys getting my point? So, but what we need to do, if our project is having multiple environments, in the every environment, we need to install all required softwares. We need to install all the required softwares in all environments to run our application. We need to make sure we are using same versions of softwares in all machines. If any software version is not matched, then application execution may fail. So for example, let us take an example. Raja installed Java 11 version in dev environment. Raja installed Java 11 version in the dev environment. Sunil installed Java 8 version in the SIT environment. The application which is working in the dev environment is not working in the SIT environment because of version problem. So Raja installed Java 11 version in the dev environment. By mistake, Sunil installed Java 8 version in the sit environment. So they have a complaint. Testers are saying that application is not working in the sit environment. Developers are saying that application is working in our system. Why it will not work in your system? So it is a developer's mistake, tester's mistake, or a DevOps mistake. Developers told that we have developed the code, we have tested that code is working in our computer. But what testers are telling? Testers are telling that your code is not working in our systems. So the code which worked in the dev environment, same code is not working in the sit environment. Is it mistake of the developers? Is it mistake of the testers? Is it mistake of the operations team? It is the mistakes of the operations team. So by mistake they installed Java 8 version in the sit environment. Actually, application requires Java 11 version. So it is very difficult to maintain all the versions in all the environments. It is very difficult to maintain all the versions in all the environments. Are you guys getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? Come on. Now, to overcome this problem, we are going to use a concept called Docker. To overcome this problem, we are going to use a concept called Docker. Life with Docker. So when we use Docker, Docker will take care of all the softwares which are required to run our application. When we go for the Docker, so when you are using Docker to run your application, you no need to install the softwares in all the machines, because Docker is going to take care of all the softwares that are required to run our application. Sir, how Docker is going to take care of all the softwares that are required? We will understand that. So before going to understand what is the Docker, how it is going to solve our problem, did you get the clarity? Did you get the clarity on what is application and what is application architecture? What technologies we are going to use to develop the application? Application nothing but collection of programs, and every application contains 3 layers. Front end will be available, back end will be available, database will be available. Front end contains user interface. To develop the front end, there are several technologies like Angular, React, Vue.js. To develop the backend contains the business logic. So the backend can be developed by using several technologies like Java, .NET, Python, Node.js, PHP. For every project, database is required to store the data. Some projects will use Oracle, some projects will use MySQL, SQL Server, Postgres, and MongoDB. Like this, different tech stacks will be available for a project. Now, in order to run this project, front-end, back-end, and database, front-end components should execute, back-end components should execute, database also should execute. In order to execute all the components, we are going to prepare an environment. So a computer, in that computer, all the required software should be installed. Then only we can run our application. In the real time, we will have multiple environments to run the application. So what environments will be available in the real time? In the real time, we will have dev environment, sit environment, UAT environment, and prod environment. So what is this dev environment? Dev environment is used by the developers to perform testing, right? So whatever the code they have written, that the code is working as expected or not, the developers are going to test it in the dev environment. Once the developers testing is completed, then it will go to sit environment. Sit environment nothing but system integration testing environment that will done by testing team, which is also called as QA. Quality assurance team will do that testing. Once the testers certify that all the functionalities are working, then the project will go to UAT environment. So that is client-side testing. UAT stands for user acceptance testing. Once the UAT completed, pilot environment will be available. That is pre-production environment to test our application with live data. Once the testing completed in all the above environments, then it will be deployed into production environment. Production environment means the live environment. End users will access application from production environment. Production environment. Good. Now here, let's talk about life without Docker. If our project is not using Docker, then what operations team has to do? So operations team is responsible to prepare all the required environments for the project. So now DevOps team will be available for a project. The DevOps team is responsible to build and deploy the project. In order to build and deploy the project, the DevOps team has to install all the required softwares for the project. So now, in the DevOps team, multiple team members are available. Assume that in our DevOps team, multiple team members are available. Raja, and here Ashok is available, Sunil is available, Naveen is available. These all are DevOps team members. So now everybody is getting a task. So as a manager assigned the task to, manager has assigned one task to Raja to set up the dev environment. So Raja has installed all the required softwares to run the application in the dev environment. He used some versions, right? Same versions should be maintained in all the other environments. But Naveen is a new team member. Naveen is not aware of this process. Naveen installed Angular 13, Java 8, Oracle 15, Tomcat 9. So, but actually our project requires Angular 14 and Java 11. So with this, version compatibility problem occurred. So the code which is working in the dev environment is not working in the sit environment. So testers started raising the bugs in the project saying that code is not working. Developers are saying that code worked in the dev environment, why it will not work in the sit environment? Here the problem is versions, software's dependency. So what are the softwares that are required for our application? These softwares are called as dependencies of our application. So in order to run the application, only code is not sufficient. Along with the code, dependencies are required. So if you just take a computer, we can't run the project. In that computer, we need to install the required softwares. Then only we can run our application. It is the responsibility of the operations team to install the required softwares to run our application into all the environment-based machines. Are you clear? What is the problem if I don't use Docker in my project? We need to install all the required softwares in all the environments to run our application. We need to make sure we are using same versions of softwares in all machines. If any software version is not matched, then application execution may fail. Application execution may fail. So if you want to install our application, if you want to run our application, if you want to deploy our application, if we want to run our application in multiple machines, then we have to install required softwares in all those machines, which is hectic task. Are you guys clear? If we want to run our application in multiple machines, then we have to install the required softwares in all the machines, which is a hectic task for the operations team. So to simplify this process, we are going to use Docker. Are you guys clear with my point? Suppose my project is having 20 environments. If my project is having 20 environments, in all the 20 environments, we need to install the required software. If any software version is not matched, then we are gone. Application is not going to execute. Now, here, how we are going to solve this problem? So to solve this problem, we are going to use Docker. Now remember, to run the application, we need to set up dependencies. The softwares which are required to run our application are called as dependencies. So code plus dependencies required to execute our project. So code will be given by the developers. dependencies we have to configure as a DevOps engineer. Code plus dependencies, then only we can execute our application. So now life with Docker, life with Docker. So Docker is a containerization platform. Docker is a containerization platform. Docker is used to build and deploy our application into any machine without bothering about the dependencies. So what is the meaning of dependencies? Example, dependencies can be any software. Dependencies, it may be a Angular, or it may be a React, or it may be Java, it may be DB, it may be server, etc. These are called as dependencies. Operating system also a dependency. I want to run my application in the Linux machine. I want to install the softwares in the Linux machine. So here we are going to install all the softwares in the machines wherever we want to run our application. Now, I don't want to install the softwares on my own, because if I do this process manually, there is a chance of doing the mistake. Humans will do the mistakes, right? So when the DevOps engineer do the mistake, then our application execution will fail. So that's why I don't want to install the dependencies manually. I want to use the Docker, life with Docker. What is the Docker? Docker is a containerization platform. Docker is used to build and deploy our application into any machine without bothering about the dependencies. So what is the meaning of dependencies? Dependencies means the softwares that are required to run our application. Dependencies means the softwares which are required to run our application. So dependencies, the dependency can be operating system. Angular is a dependency for the project, or React is a dependency for the project. Java is a dependency for the project. Database is dependency for the project. Tomcat server is dependency for the project. Dependencies means the softwares which are required to run our application. Now, so here, when you use the Docker, Docker is used to build and deploy our application into any machine without bothering about the dependencies. So dependencies means the softwares which are required to run our application. Now here, how we are going to use this Docker? So guys, first, here, which is softwares that are required for our application, we are going to mention them inside one file called Docker file. We are going to create one file called Docker file. In this Docker file, I will configure the dependencies that I want. What are the dependencies I want? The dependencies information will be configured in the Docker file. Dependencies list. What are the softwares that are required for our application that we are going to configure in the Docker file? And I will specify application code. Code plus dependencies will be available, right? So dependencies list. What are the softwares that are required to run our application? The dependencies I'm going to configure in the Docker file. So when you want to work with the Docker file will be available. What is the Docker file? Docker file contains the instructions to download required dependencies. I will tell to Docker, hey Docker, I want Linux operating system. I want Java 11 version. I want Angular 14 version. I want to Tomcat 9 version. Like this, which is softwares that you want to run your application that we are going to specify in the Docker file. And the code is available in the GitHub. So assume that this is my code. Application source code will be available. So now application code will be given by the developers, and what are the softwares that we need to install in our machine? The softwares list we are going to configure in the Docker file. Now here, by using this application code and application dependencies, we are going to create one Docker image. By using this application code and application dependencies, we are going to build one Docker image. We are going to build one Docker image. So now what will be there in the Docker image? This Docker image contains code plus dependencies. So whatever the code is required to run our application, application code and application dependencies will be packaged as a Docker image, right? So now you have the code which is given by the developers. The code is available in the repository somewhere. The code is available. In order to run that code, I need softwares. What are the softwares? Those are softwares are called as dependencies. Those dependencies we have configured in the Docker file. Now by using the code and the Docker file, we are going to build a Docker image. So what is a Docker image? Docker image is nothing but a package which contains the code plus dependencies. Once the Docker image is created, that Docker image we can store into Docker Hub. We can store the Docker image into Docker Hub. Docker Hub is nothing but a Docker registry, right? Because my image is created, that image contains application code plus application dependencies. My image contains application code plus application dependencies. So whatever the Docker image is created, that Docker image we are pushing to Docker Hub. Docker Hub is called as Docker registry, which is used to store the Docker images. Now, when you want to run your application, you just need to take the Docker image and you run your application. Now, I want to run my application in multiple computers. So this is my dev environment. I want to run my application in the dev environment. I want to run my application in the sit environment. I want to run my application in the UAT environment. I want to run my application in the production environment. Now, do I need to install any softwares in order to run this application? No. Already Docker image is available. That Docker image you can take and you can execute the Docker image in any computer without bothering about which softwares are available. Now this is a Docker image that I have pushed to the Docker image. Here, pull the Docker image. Whatever the Docker image is available, pull the Docker image into dev environment and execute that. Pull the Docker image into dev environment, execute that. Pull the Docker image to UAT and execute that. Pull the Docker image to the production and execute that. So whether this machine is a Windows machine or Linux machine, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. So this is dev environment and this is a sit environment and this is UAT environment and this is production environment. Okay. Now here, just run the Docker image. So pull the Docker image and run the Docker image. Run Docker image. So whenever you run the Docker image, pull the image and run the Docker image. Whenever you run the Docker image, Docker will create a container to run our application. Whenever we run the Docker image, Docker will create a container in our computer. So in that container, our application will execute. Run Docker image. What is the image? The image contains application code plus application dependencies. What is the meaning of dependencies? Dependencies is nothing but the softwares that are required for our application. So this is the life with Docker. Now, I want to run my application in any computer. Yes, you can do it because already we have created a Docker image for our project. What is the Docker image? Docker image contains the code plus dependencies. Docker image contains code plus dependencies. So what is the meaning of how Docker will understand which dependencies I want? We are writing a Docker file. In that Docker file, we are going to specify which operating system is required to run our application, which version of the Angular is required to run our application, which version of the Java is required to run our application, which version of the Tomcat is required to run our application. All that information we are going to configure in the Docker file. So code will be available, Docker file will be available. So once the code and Docker file is available, we are going to build a Docker image. So what is a Docker image? Docker image nothing but a package which contains application code plus application dependencies which are required to run our application. Code is available, dependencies. That means code is available, softwares are available. So once this Docker image is created, we can store the Docker image for the future purpose in the Docker Hub. Docker Hub is called as a Docker registry where we can store the images. The Docker images are two types. We can make them as a public image or private image. Public image means anybody can access. Private image means only our organization can access. So in the real time, our project Docker images will be private Docker images so that only our company will access those Docker images. So public images means anybody can access that. Now see here, Docker Hub website will be available here for the Docker Hub. Now Docker Hub, that is called Docker registry, hub.docker.com, image library. So Docker image library is available. So you can create an account in the Docker Hub. It is free of cost. I have an account in the Docker Hub and I have stored several images in my Docker Hub. So what are the projects we are building? Those projects we are creating as a Docker images. The Docker images we are storing in the Docker Hub. See, 437 downloads happened for the Maven web application. It is a Docker image. 15 downloads, 21 downloads. So 3000 downloads available for Spring Boot MySQL project, Spring Boot MongoDB project. Okay, Java web application here. 65,000 downloads are available for Spring Boot REST API. 1 year back, I pushed this image to Docker Hub. 65,000 people downloaded my Docker image to run that application. So these are the Docker images I have created, and I stored these Docker images into my Docker Hub account. So now if I want to run this Spring Boot application, Spring Boot REST API in any computer, I no need to install Java. I no need to install database. I no need to install the server because everything is already packaged into Docker image. We can just download the Docker image and we can run the Docker image. When you run the Docker image, it is going to create a Docker container. When you run the Docker image, it is going to create a concept called container. Container is a one virtual box. In that container, our application will execute. So when we are running the Docker images, Docker image will create a Docker container. Inside the container, our application plus application dependencies will be available. Now, I want to run my project in the 100 computers. Do I need to install the softwares in the 100 computers? I just need to pull the image and run the image. Guys, I want to run my project in the 100 machines. Do I need to install the softwares in the 100 machines? I just need to pull the image and run the image. Do I need to install the softwares in the 100 machines, or I just need to pull the image and run the image? Come on. I need to install the softwares in 100 machines, or I just need to pull the image and run the image? Now, so when you go for this Docker, is there any chance of getting version problems in the multiple environments? Is there any chance of getting the version problems in the multiple environments? Come on, guys. No. Human is installing the software. Docker is installing the softwares to run our project. Operational engineer is installing the softwares to run the project. Docker is installing the softwares to run the project. Docker is installing the software. How Docker will understand which softwares are required to run our application? How Docker will understand which softwares are required to run our application? Docker file. Docker file contains a set of instructions. So what are the dependencies that are required? Those dependencies we are going to configure in the Docker file. Application code will be available. Docker file will be available. By using application code and a Docker file, we are going to build a Docker image. That a Docker image we can store for the future use in the Docker Hub. Docker Hub is a Docker registry. Docker registry. So in which computer you want to run your application, you just pull the Docker image and you run the Docker image. When you run the Docker image, Docker container will be created. In the Docker container, our application will be executed. In the Docker container, our application will be executed. Now see, life without Docker, life with Docker. Which one is easy? Life without Docker, life with Docker. Which one is easy? Life with Docker. So that means the Docker is going to reduce the time to deploy our applications. The Docker is reducing the time to deploy our applications. Now, you may get a question. Ashok, who will write this Docker file? In the project, who will write the Docker file? In some projects, developers will write the Docker file. In some projects, DevOps engineers will write the Docker file. Both developers and DevOps engineers should know how to write a Docker file, how to create a Docker image, how to push the Docker image, how to pull the Docker image, how to run the Docker image. Developers as well as the DevOps engineers should have the idea on the Docker. Okay, so some projects, developers will write the Docker file. In some projects, DevOps engineers will write the Docker file. In the interview, they will ask you what is Docker, Docker architecture, Docker file, Docker image, Docker hub, Docker container. In the interview, Docker is a favorite topic for them, Docker and Kubernetes, because it is using heavily in the market. Nowadays, almost all the projects are using the Docker because of its features. If you see the logo for the Docker logo is ship symbol. Can you see the Docker logo is a ship? Why they have given ship? That means easily you can ship the Docker images and easily you can transfer from one computer to another computer. Easily we can execute them. So Docker is having a ship logo. The ship means easily shippable. So the Docker image which is available in the Docker hub, easily we can pull the image into any computer and we can run that image. So that the Docker image contains code plus dependencies. So whatever the code that is required for our application and what are the dependencies that are required for our application, code plus dependencies will be available in the image. In order to create the image, Docker file is required. Docker file contains a set of instructions to create the image. Once the Docker image is created, we can store the Docker image into Docker hub. So if you want to run the Docker image, you just pull the Docker image and you run the Docker image. When you run the Docker image, Docker container will be created. What is that Docker container? Docker container will have our application. So now I have 5 environments to run my application. You pull the image, run the image. That's it. You no need to install Java. You no need to install database. You no need to install Tomcat. All the software's installation will be taken care by Docker. Right. So in order, what we need to do is, in order to create the image, in order to run the image, Docker software we have to install first. Docker software we will install. Once the Docker software is installed, then we can build the image, we can run the image. So in these machines, we no need to install all the softwares required for the application. We need to install Docker software in these machines. Once you install the Docker software in these machines, then you can run the Docker image. Getting my point? Docker we need to install in these machines. The remaining softwares required for the application, Docker will take care. So life with Docker. What is the Docker? Docker is a containerization platform. It is used to build and deploy our application into any machine without bothering about the dependencies. Dependencies means the softwares which are required to run our application. Now, Docker will reduce the gap between development and deployment. So developers are writing the code. That code we need to deploy. To deploy the code, environment should be prepared. Software should be installed. So if you are using Docker, do you need to bother about the softwares which are required? No. Docker is going to reduce the gap between the development and deployment. So coming to Docker architecture. So when we are talking about the Docker architecture, the first thing that we need to talk about is Docker file. The first thing that we need to talk is Docker file. Then we need to talk about Docker image, and we need to talk about Docker registry, and we need to talk about Docker container. We need to talk about Docker container. So this Docker you can install in the Windows as well as you can install in the Linux also, right? So Docker architecture. So Docker file. Docker file contains it contains instructions to build Docker image. It contains instructions to build Docker image. Okay. What is the Docker image? It is a package. It is a package which contains code plus dependencies. The softwares which are required to run our application are called as dependencies. Docker registry, it is a repository to store Docker images. Docker registry is a repository. It is used to store the Docker images. The next one, Docker container. It is a runtime process. It is a runtime process which runs our application. Once the Docker image is available, we can pull that image and we can run that image in any machine. Once the Docker image is created, then we can pull that image. We can pull that image and we can run that image in any machine without bothering about the dependencies. Dependencies will be taken care by Docker. How Docker will understand what are the dependencies required? Already we are writing a Docker file. In the Docker file, we will configure the list of softwares that are required and code will be available. Using that code and the Docker file, Docker image will be created. Image is a package which contains the code plus dependencies. That image we can push into Docker Hub. Then that image we can pull into any machine and we can run the image. When we run the image, Docker container will create. What is the Docker container? Docker container is a runtime process which executes our application. So if you want to access our application, we need to access the container, Docker container. Docker images are reusable. So one image, whatever the Docker image is available now, you have seen in my Docker Hub account, 65,000 people downloaded my image and they have executed my application. So the Docker images are reusable. Once we create the image, that image can be executed in any computer. Once I create the image, that image can be executed